So, once again, welcome from all over the world that you're joining us, but even more from so many different networks, faith-based and civil society networks. So thank you. Thank you for joining our ERI Zoom Trainings 2026 series, which is made possible thanks to a grant from from Irish Aid, through Mission Cara, and through Edmund Rice Development. Our first session today is on the foundations of human rights and advocacy, and this is being presented by Brother Brian Bond. Um, just a very brief introduction of Brother Brian Bond. He's the executive director of Edmund Rice International, and along with myself, I'm Brother Tino Diabrio, um, and Sue Cochran, who's an Ursuline sister from Australia. Um, we form the team here in Geneva. Brian will tell you a little more about Edmund Rice International when he starts. Brian has over 25 years of experience in the school as teacher, principal, administrator before he joined ERI. He's one of the founding members also of ERI, which began in 2007. So before I hand over to you, Brian, okay, I'm going to invite everyone in the chat box. If you can just share a little bit about yourself, your name, your organization, where you are joining us from, and the work or ministry you engage with. So I'll just give you a moment to do that if you haven't already done that. Today we have um, English to Spanish interpretation. We have a couple of Spanish speakers who are joining us, mainly, I think, from Latin America. Okay, and we are very happy to have Flavia Castillo, who is our interpreter, who has been our interpreter for many years now for these Zoom sessions. So, welcome, Flavia, and to be able um, to be able to access the Spanish interpretation, please go to the bottom of your screen. I hope you understand this, the Spanish speakers, since I'm speaking in English, and click on interpretation and then choose Spanish. Okay, Flavia, if you just come across and say that in Spanish on the main channel, the English channel, that will be good. Flavia, are you able to join us on the English channel? If you can just respond to me, please. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, I don't know what's happening there, but all right. I'll get back to you, Flavia, but I'll just finish this presentation. View the presentations on speaker view, all right? And that's the best way to actually view them. And during the presentation, your microphone will be disabled, which I've already done. Okay, the chat box will also be disabled so that there's no distraction from the presentation. But however, during and after the presentation, there will be little breaks, and I will enable the chat box so that you can share comments, highlights, and put forward your questions and clarifications. Why do we have this? What's the objective of our Zoom training? The main objective is to create an awareness of human rights and advocacy, care of the earth, and bring about a change of mindset from a charity or service model to a rights-based model of operating. Another objective is also to create an advocacy networking platform where participants can learn from one another, share their experiences, collaborate with, and support one another. So, with that, I'm going to stop my sharing. But before I hand over to you, Brian, I just want to check if Flavia, if everything is fine at your end. Yeah? Okay, great. Um, okay, Brian. Okay, over to you to tell us a little bit about ERI before you launch into your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Tino, and greetings to everybody. Edmund Rights International, or ERI, is a non-government organisation that was established in Geneva in 2007 to engage with the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. ERI is supported by two Catholic religious congregations who were both founded by Blessed Edmund Rights, the Christian Brothers and the Presentation Brothers. And we work with our networks and partners in 25 or so countries where the two countries are present. And we have a special interest in the rights of children, the right to education, and in the care of the earth. And so we're pleased to have this opportunity to engage with you all. We're also concerned with issues such as the rights of Indigenous people, the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, people with disabilities, to mention a few, because we take up any issue that members of our network are concerned with in a particular country. Over the years, we have conducted training for members of our network in various countries and here in Geneva and online, and then we rely on them, our former trainees, to provide us with the information that we need to engage with the various human rights mechanisms that I'll speak about later in this presentation. So at this point, I will share my screen. Um,
Yeah, Brian, while you're doing that, I just want to respond to one participant who asked for French interpretation. We do not have French interpretation, but we do have subtitles. If you go to maybe more and ask to show captions, okay, you'll be able to set the language you'd like to read the captions in for this meeting, and there you can choose French. Okay, you can also choose Hindi for those who are Hindi speakers, since we do not have Hindi interpretation today. All right, you have French, France subtitles as well as French Canada subtitles. So please, you can do that. Okay, thank you, Brian. Back to you.
you can see the screen.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So I want to, in this presentation, talk briefly about three things. One is the nature of advocacy, secondly, about human rights, and thirdly, to give an overview, a brief overview of the whole UN system. And to clarify what we mean by advocacy or a justice response as opposed to a charity or service response, I'll recount my experience of working with students from our schools back in Melbourne some years ago before coming to Geneva, where we engaged in what was called a street retreat. And I would take a group of students to a local parish where we would link up with the volunteers from the St. Vincent de Paul Society, who organised a soup van where they distributed unsold food collected at the end of the day from local shops, prepared soup, and then drove a van to a pre-arranged location where the food was distributed to homeless people, people living on the streets, or people living in cheap boarding houses. And at the end of the experience, we would have a debrief, and the students shared and reflected on their experience. And they felt very positive about that, as we all do when we do something good for others. But then I would remind them that whilst what they had done was good and important, um, nothing had changed for those people. And in a few days, the students would be returning back home to their warm bed, their mother's cooking, but those people would still be there on the street next week, next month, possibly next year, which led to the why question. Why, in an affluent society like Australia, are people forced to live on the streets? Also, what does it say about the way our society cared for those suffering from mental illness? Because only a brief conversation with a number of the people we met with showed that they were suffering from some form of mental illness. So, asking why is the first step in advocacy, which aims to address the underlying causes of injustice. And how do we address those causes? By speaking to those who have the power to make a change, or better still, by empowering those affected to speak up for themselves. Usually, advocacy is directed at governments, perhaps multinational businesses or banks. For example, I joined a campaign not so long ago and emailed directors of a Korean bank urging them to reject the financing of a proposed new coal mining project in Australia. Advocacy can take many forms: letter writing, signing petitions, in person lobbying, marches, demonstrations, and it can take place at the local level, the national level, or the international level, which we're addressing in this webinar. So, in summary, charity provides direct services like food, clothing, and shelter. Justice promotes social change in institutions or political structures. I'd like to stress that it's not a case of either or. Both charity and advocacy are important. Charity is directed at the effects of injustice, its symptoms, and it addresses problems that already exist. Justice is directed at the root causes of social problems and addresses the underlying structures or causes of those problems. Charity responds to immediate needs and looks for immediate solutions. Justice responds to long-term needs and looks for long-term solutions, and that requires patience and perseverance. Charity is often about private individual actions, and justice is most effective when it's public collective action. Charity calms things down, whereas advocacy stirs things up. We know from current and recent examples in places like Myanmar and Iran and Russia and others, when demands for human rights challenge those in power, those who have an interest in preserving their privileged position can respond with repression and violence. Sadly, there are many current examples of threats and violence perpetrated on those who speak up for human rights or condemn injustice in many parts of the world. Jesus himself challenged the system in Israel of his time. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple that he saw as exploiting people. He condemned the Pharisees and religious leaders as hypocrites, false guides, whitened sepulchres, and the rest, a stand that was ultimately to cost him his life. So I think this quotation sums up what this last point. It's from Helder Camara, a former bishop of Recife in Brazil. He said, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist." So I hope that makes clear what we mean by advocacy. And we'll just pause there, as Tino said, and we'll give you a chance to think about that. Over to Tino. So, the particular form of advocacy that we want to speak about is the work we engage with through the Human Rights Council of the United Nations here in Geneva. And that involves framing the issues in terms of human rights. We call this a rights-based approach or rights-based advocacy, in contrast to what could be called a needs-based approach. When people are hungry, we can argue that they need food to survive. But when advocating at the UN, it's necessary to argue in terms of people's right to food. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, includes the words, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services." It was written back in 1948, hence the rather sexist language, but it's understood to apply to women as well, of course. So a needs-based approach to advocacy asks, what are the presenting issues and needs in a particular community? While a rights-based approach asks, what rights are being neglected or violated in this situation? Traditionally, a response has been to identify the need and then seek ways in collaboration with the community to address the situation through providing service, support, or assistance. In a rights-based approach, the next question that arises is, why is it that these people can't enjoy their rights? And a feature of a rights-based approach is that the rights holders whose rights are denied can first come to a realization that they have rights to which they are entitled, and then be empowered to find their voices and challenge the duty bearers, those who hold power, to change the unjust structures that hold them in bondage and deny them their capacity to live fully human lives. It might not always be possible that people can speak up for themselves through a lack of education or through imprisonment or through being at risk if they speak up, and so it might need others to speak on their behalf. ERI again spoke at the current Human Rights Council session on behalf of a group of NGOs in Myanmar because those people feared reprisal if they were identified. However, where possible, it's better for people to be able to speak for themselves, and this can enhance their dignity and self-worth. A needs-based approach, on the other hand, has the risk that people can become passive recipients of charity. ERI's UN submissions are prepared by the people themselves as far as possible, facilitated by members of our network in regard to the wording and in negotiating the UN procedures. And we've made a number of in this presentation, I've made a number of references to human rights. So what I want to do next is to have a closer look at what we actually mean by human rights. And we're going to commence by having a look at a video which charts the history of human rights. A video will take about 10 minutes, and just give me a moment and I'll again share my screen and share the video. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, let's start.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Well, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal, human,
The rights that humans have?
Oh, that's a very large debate.
Så mange ting.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, è una domanda complicatissima.
That we just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live,
equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded. But the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, Why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers. Free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent. Who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
Okay, so we saw there from that video that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the culmination of centuries of struggle, and it was the horrors experienced in the world wars of the 20th century that led to the establishment of the UN and agreement about human rights. Regrettably, at present, we're seeing a retreat from human rights and the ideals of the United Nations at the very time we most need solidarity in the face of a recent COVID pandemic and the climate emergency. And instead, we're seeing a reassertion of nationalism in places such as the US under President Trump, in China, Russia, the United Kingdom with its withdrawal from Europe. The list goes on, but that's a story we don't have time to go into. But we're also seeing a retreat from multilateralism or countries working together with the withdrawal of the United States from the Human Rights Council, from the climate agreement, and by cutting off funding to UN agencies and cancelling US aid. These are all examples of this. So I'm going to go back now to sharing the PowerPoint. Okay, so I'd just like to add that rights, as was stressed in the video, are universal and inalienable. They apply to all people everywhere at all times, and they can be denied or violated, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. They're indivisible. They're all equally important and must be respected. A criticism of, say, a country like the US is that political rights such as the right to free speech and peaceful assembly, etc., well, in the past anyway, were certainly stressed, but other rights such as a right to an adequate standard of living was not assigned the same priority, which resulted in unacceptable levels of poverty in a country like the US. And in contrast, a country like China made great strides in lifting people out of poverty, but there are serious concerns about its respect for civil and political rights, the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc. The point is that all rights are important. You can't just select some of them. And no country has a perfect record on human rights. Also, the rights are interdependent and interrelated. The fulfillment of one right often depends wholly or in part upon the fulfillment of others. For example, the fulfillment of the right to an adequate standard of living may depend on having access to education or to social security, or the enjoyment of the right to education might depend on having the right to food. A child that comes to school hungry may not be in a position to learn properly, for example. I would also add that it sometimes can be difficult to balance different rights. For example, freedom of speech. Does that mean that hate speech is acceptable, or incitement to violence that might threaten the life and the well-being of another? What about freedom of speech and the right to privacy? Are we free to speak about the private lives of celebrities, as happens in certain types of gossip magazines? Then there's also the issue of abortion. How do we balance a woman's right to health, for example, with the right of the unborn child? It would be true to say that the UN perceives the rights of the health of women taking precedence over the right to life of the unborn child. Although there's no recognised right to abortion, the term reproductive rights is often used in a way that assumes a right to abortion. And that perhaps raises another more basic question: does an unborn child have rights at all? A related question might be about children's rights. Should children be free to exercise all their rights when perhaps they lack maturity and experience and could be at risk of harming themselves? Children's rights are spelt out in more detail about in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'll speak about later. And Article 5 of that convention speaks of a child's right to receive appropriate direction and guidance from their parents and guardians. So, who is responsible for ensuring human rights? The answer is we all are. We have a duty to respect the rights of others, but perhaps governments have a particular responsibility. In making presentations like this, particularly to teachers, I often hear things like, it's all very well to speak to students about their rights, but what about their responsibilities? And I think the answer to that is to remind them that everyone has rights. Everyone has the same rights and they must be respected. It's not just about my rights. And as I've said, governments bear a particular responsibility and they are the major duty bearers. So, as we saw in that video, the UN was established following World War II. Its aim was to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, and to achieve cooperation in solving international problems. The UN today is a vast, complex organisation, so don't try and remember all the detail of what I'm going to present, but just try and get an overall sense of it. So, first of all, there are 6 major organs of the United Nations. There's the General Assembly that meets in New York. Secondly, there's a Security Council, which, as its name suggests, has got particular responsibility for ensuring maintaining international peace. Interestingly, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council that have the right to veto any decision of the Council. And they're the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And you might ask, how did they come to have a veto? Well, they were all on the winning side in World War II, so they could make the decision. There's the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, which is also based in New York and has responsibility for advancing sustainable development in economic, social, and environmental spheres. There's the International Court of Justice, which is based in The Hague in the Netherlands, which is there to settle legal disputes submitted to it by states and to give advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by the United Nations and specialised agencies. The International Court of Justice is not to be confused with the International Criminal Court, a separate body which deals with war crimes, and it's not recognized by all countries. There's the Secretariat, which is the vast bureaucracy which supports the work of the UN. And there's the Trusteeship Council, which is in brackets because it's no longer active. It was set up to oversee the transition of former colonies and territories to self-governance. So those principal organs of the UN oversee a range of subsidiary bodies, committees, boards, councils, working parties. And one of the most important is the Human Rights Council, which meets in Geneva, and it has particular responsibility for strengthening, promoting, and protecting human rights. And NGOs can apply to make statements during discussions or debates at sessions of the Human Rights Council, and those statements can be useful in raising awareness about particular issues of concern. And ERI has made a number of statements, some with our partners, during the current Human Rights Council session. And there are 3 council sessions during the year, and we try and participate in all of those. Links to the webcast recordings of those statements are included in our monthly newsletter. Some other examples of UN organisations and agencies that you're possibly aware of. UNESCO is in Paris, the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization are both based in Geneva. The UN Environmental Programme is based in Nairobi, and there are others. The UN has also adopted a whole range of treaties, conventions, protocols, and declarations. We've already mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the most important, but there are 9 core human rights treaties that you can see listed there. I should mention that it's countries volunteer to be bound by these treaties. They ratify them by their own parliaments, and they do have a legal status, but they can't be enforced because the UN has no international enforcement mechanism. So I should mention that there are optional protocols, and I'll explain briefly an example of an optional protocol. There are additional legal provisions that complement an existing treaty, which must be ratified separately by countries. For example, as you can see there, the Convention on the Rights of the Child came into force in 1989, but that was before the internet existed. And since then, a whole range of issues related to child pornography and child trafficking, etc., have arisen as a result of the internet. So rather than attempt to rewrite the convention, an additional treaty was drafted, which can be ratified separately by member states. And that's an example of what I mean by an optional protocol. Declarations are not intended to be legally binding, but are intended to give voice to particular aspirations. The major treaties, as you can see there, and the dates where they came into force, they're listed. Civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. So they spell out in more detail what's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which was the first human rights treaty that came in, mainly as a result of a response to the situation of apartheid in South Africa. Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in 1999. I've mentioned the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention Against Torture, the International Convention on the Protection of Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, much more recent, 2006, and then the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. So as I said, it's up to each UN member state to agree to be bound by and ratify a treaty. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely accepted treaty, and it's been ratified by every country in the world except the United States. And the provisions of a treaty only apply to those countries that have ratified it. You can go online and visit the UN website to see if your country has ratified a particular treaty. So The UN has set up committees of independent experts to monitor states' compliance with the treaties that they've committed to. These are called treaty bodies. And the treaty bodies consider the states' reports, but they also have a mechanism to consider individual complaints or communications. And they also publish general comments on the content of the treaties and organise discussions on related themes. The treaty bodies meet in Geneva, and when a country ratifies one of the treaties, it assumes an obligation to implement the rights organised in that treaty, and it also has an obligation to submit regular reports to the treaty body on how the rights are being implemented. So the treaty body accepts the government report, but in addition, it can receive information from other sources, including non-government organisations. And in the light of the information provided from all sources, the committee examines the nation's report and meets with government representatives, and they have a discussion. And based on the dialogue, the committee then publishes its concerns and recommendations referred to as concluding observations. And these are recommendations about how a country can do better to meet its obligations under the treaty. So another option for advocacy groups like ourselves is to submit an alternative report with questions and recommendations to the committee undertaking the review of a particular country, which hopefully would then be addressed during the review. So ERI has engaged with that mechanism. And of course, submitting reports is just one task. There's also a very important role for advocates in following up recommendations and commitments made by the governments which are publicly available. And that can be done even if you haven't submitted a report. And raising awareness about these mechanisms and reports in itself is a very important step in advocacy. The Human Rights Council also oversees two important mechanisms for monitoring human rights: the Universal Periodic Review and special procedures. Firstly, the UPR. Every country in the world has its human rights record reviewed by other countries every 4 to 5 years in Geneva. Well, that was until last November when the United States withdrew from the Human Rights Council. Again, NGOs can submit reports and make recommendations, and then we can approach other UN member states and ask them to put forward our issues of concern. That's something which we do here in Geneva, but it can also be done by lobbying foreign embassies in your own country. Earlier this year, ERI submitted statements for the review of Australia, which took place in January. Recently, we made a joint submission for the reviews of Sierra Leone, and we're currently working on submissions for Ireland and Tanzania, which will be reviewed in November. And following that, we plan to draft submissions for the upcoming reviews of Haiti, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. And you'll learn more about the UPR later in this course if you attend the other sessions. So finally, a brief word on special procedures. The Human Rights Council can appoint an independent expert or rapporteur or working group, they're all different names for much the same thing, to examine and report on the situation in a particular country or on a particular theme. Currently, there are 46 thematic and 14 country mandates. So some examples of thematic mandates: we have a special rapporteur on the right to food, the special rapporteur on the right to education, the special rapporteur on the right to safe drinking water and sanitation, on trafficking in persons, especially women and children. As I said, there are 46 in total. And then there are countries that have particular concerns about the human rights situation, and so they have a special rapporteur appointed. And those countries are Afghanistan, Belarus, Burundi, Cambodia, Central African Republic, North Korea, Eritrea, Iran, Mali, Myanmar, Palestine, the occupied Palestine territories, Russia, Somalia, and Syria. So NGOs can make direct contact with special rapporteurs to raise issues of concern or request that the rapporteur make a visit to their country. They can also raise awareness about the recommendations made in the reports of the Special Rapporteur, and they can engage in advocacy with their governments about implementing the recommendations made by the rapporteurs. So again, just to finally wrap up, in all of these procedures, it's important to remember the UN doesn't have the power to compel states to do anything, and many states ignore or defy the international community. However, states are sensitive to international opinion, and they can be open to respectful, well thought out suggestions and recommendations, and positive change is possible, and that gives us hope. So I will stop there and I'll hand back to Tino.
Thanks, Brian.